我也要感谢说我很感谢我们的翻译，因为现在我们知道我们说的讨论有一些很详细的、很有比较难的说法的部分，所以我知道现在马上做这个翻译是一个很难的工作，所以这个我真的祝贺你，谢谢你。好的。So as we I think 谢谢。我的工作是比较容易的，他们的是难的。But today I want to just take 20 minutes or so to speak a little bit about the background to the subject that I put before you here, how the past, present and future are coming together to shape, I hope, a more stable shape for Asia and for the wider region and world. And in doing so, I want to speak in particular about the importance of the interpretation of history in shaping the region. Now, I think that there is a very clear link with what Professor Duara has said, because he has spoken very eloquently about the importance of power, cultural power, economic power, even military power, in shaping ideas of how nations and regions think about themselves. And I want to add one specific element to that, which is two historical narratives, two ideas of history which are relevant to China, but not just about China. One to do with the Silk Road, which of course is on all of our minds with the emergence of the 一带一路 One Belt, One Road, Belt and Road initiative, but also the shared history of the more recent modern history of the Second World War, of the war of resistance against Japan here in China, and the European and Asian theatres of World War II for the United States and for the British Empire, amongst others. And in doing so, I can show, I think, a few examples. The first, most obvious one is to talk a little bit about the new Silk Road and about the new maritime structures that underpin the One Belt, One Road policy. It's evident that this creates new diplomatic and trading opportunities, not just for China, but for the countries which are entwined and combined in this new proposed network. But what I think needs to be noted is that in some ways it throws back the historical center of gravity, the center of attention, much more onto the Eurasian continent. For a long time the attention has been on the Pacific. There are very good reasons for that concentration on the Pacific. But at the same time, I think it is important to understand that the proposal to place much more of the center of economic gravity and trade in the countries of Central Asia and even of South Asia, which again Professor Duara mentioned, throws us back in a sense almost to the Tang Dynasty, a time when the Silk Road was very active, but also that China's own culture was reshaped in a way that was highly outward-looking and also very much shaped by the societies around it. It was a time, of course, that Chang'an, which later became Xi'an, the great Chinese capital, was marked by aristocrats wearing headgear and costumes and clothing taken from the Central Asian region, in a sign of that sort of cosmopolitan fashion which symbolized a much wider sense of Chinese identity. And I think that's worth remembering when we think about what is sometimes too easily defined as an inward-looking Chinese culture. Of course, it's well known that the traditions of Confucius, of Taoism, the Rujia, all of these have been very important in shaping the world that we think of as Chinese. The scholar Joshua Fogel has written about what he calls the Sino Sphere, the world that was shaped not just in China, but by Chinese ideas in Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, including Vietnam. But I think what's important to remember is that that Sino-sphere, that world of Chinese culture, which existed all the way up to the 19th century, has always been hybrid in many ways, a combination of cultures, in which the Confucian traditions of central China, the Buddhist traditions that came from India, and of course the ethnically very varied influences of the Mongol dynasty of the Yuan, the Manchu dynasty of the Qing, came together in a whole variety of different combinations. Chinese culture, Chinese understandings have always been plural nouns. They have never been clearly defined in one way. And sometimes when you hear, I think, a very worthwhile, very positive idea that China needs to tell the China story, I always like to remind people there is no one China story. There are many China stories, some of which argue and disagree with each other, but all of which create a lively cosmopolitanism. The worst thing you can do to tell the China story is to tell only one story. The 20th century, I think, also created a new stage in the development of the way in which China's identity merged into the wider changes in the non-European world. Again, Professor Dwara, I promise you we didn't consult on our talks beforehand, but actually they fit together very well. He has talked about the importance of imperialism in shaping the mindsets of so many non-European people in an unequal power situation in the 20th century. We should add, though, that one product of that, and this links again to issues of soft power, is the question of hybridity. In other words, the combination of cultures coming together. And I see a smile on Professor Dwara's face. He will recognize a classic work of Indian modernism in which the artist takes a combination of traditional Indian folk art along with the tactics and techniques that came from the new flat-faced, forward-facing ideas that came from modernist views of how art should be conceived. A reminder that the modernist movement, something that's very much defined as part of 20th century Western modernity, has always been shaped and influenced by a whole variety of influences that come from the wider non-European world. I used an Indian example there, partly to point out that China's story is not just about China, but to give one of my favorite examples from China. All of you, I'm sure, will know the great Chinese poet Guo Moruo, who was one of the most exciting romantic voices in poetry in the early 20th century. If you know his classic poem Tiangou, Heavenly Hound, Heavenly Dog, which contains, and again I'll give it in English, you'll probably know the original Chinese in many cases, the lines, I am the sun, I am the moon, I am the light of the stars, I am X-ray, I am the energy of the entire universe. These lines, to anyone who knows the history of modernism, will speak of at least two authors. They will of course show the influence of the great Walt Whitman, one of the most important modernist voices in America in the late 19th century. They also show the ineluctable influence of Rabindranath Tagore, perhaps the single most important intellectual in terms of 20th century cosmopolitan from any country at all. The first non-European to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, but a cultural figure of huge importance throughout the world in the early 20th century, including in Japan and in China. And his Gitanjali is one of the powerful influences that also emerges in Guo Moruo's writing. So that American, Chinese, Indian conversation in culture has been going on for a very long time and reminds us that at its most flowering, Chinese culture, pre-modern or modern, has always thrived on cosmopolitanism, hybridity, and a generosity of interaction. Of course, not all times in China's history have been outward-looking or entirely happy, and we cannot avoid the horrific events of the mid-20th century, which are known in this country as China's War of Resistance to Japan, part, of course, of the global Second World War. In China, here, of course, lasting in its main phase 8 years from 1937 to 1945. And during this period, there is on the one hand immense destruction. You have a picture here of the temporary Chinese capital, the Peidu in Chongqing, being bombed after a bombing in one of the many hundreds of air raids that hit the city during the period of the war against the Japanese, particularly between 1938 and 41. Something that did a great deal to destroy large parts of the infrastructure of nationalist China during the war. But at the same time, the wartime period also transformed China's status in the world. The journey it has taken to the present day as a world power goes through that lens of World War II, a time when China was for the first time treated as a key sovereign ally. It is no coincidence at all, that it was in 1943, just over 100 years after the Nanjing Treaty of 1842, that China finally signed the Xinqiaoyue, the new treaties that put forward the reality that China was a fully sovereign state in the community of nations, and of course has developed ever since in that sense. It was also a time when China began to form alliances that would help to create the shape of a new world, which eventually, as we know today, would lead to the United States and China perhaps becoming the two most important single nation-state actors in the world. That path was not simple or linear. We know, of course, that the United States, through its representatives, visited Mao Zedong, Zhu De, and other key figures of the Chinese Communist Party in 1944 during the war at the Communist headquarters in Yan'an. The beginning of a process of recognition by the West and the United States that new forces and new powers were at play in China and in Asia more broadly, in particular anti-imperialist nationalist movements that would of course eventually become the mainstay of the Cold War. But it was also of course at the time much more of an engagement with the then government of China under Chiang Kai-shek, shown here with Sung Mei-ling, his wife, an interpreter to the world and a powerful political figure in her own right. And here of course General Joseph Stilwell, the US Commander-in-Chief in China during the Second World War. It's a slightly odd picture because they're all smiling, even though Jiang Jieshi and Stilwell hated each other and normally would not have been smiling in private with each other. But nonetheless, this relationship showed both the plus and the minus side of the changing status of China in the World War II period. On the one hand, the formal alliance after Pearl Harbor in 1941, in which the British Empire, the United States, and China were formally allied in the war against Japan. The first time that a non-European power had formed that sort of alliance in terms of an actual combat. Historians will know that there was, of course, the 1902 Japanese-British agreement, but in terms of actual combat effectiveness, this was not a major factor in the diplomacy of the time. In this case, we had Chinese, British, and Americans actually fighting together at a time when India was still a colony, and through the actions of the Indian viceroy, was forced into the war without the consent of the Indian Nationalist Congress movement. The minus side, of course, is that this period also proved very damaging to the direct relationship between the US and China. General Stilwell and, by extension, President Roosevelt came very much to a division with Chiang Kai-shek, the increasing belief on the American side that they were not getting proper cooperation from China, the increasing belief on the Chinese side that the Americans were not giving them enough assistance, led to a huge breakdown in relations. And yet there were still important events. The 1943 Cairo Conference, still very much on the minds of policymakers in China today, at which the future of Asia was discussed, not fully decided, but discussed in a way that for the first time again brought a non-European leader literally to the forefront. And again, the symbolism of this photo with President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek and Sung Mei-ling all together sitting in equal status, I think should not be underestimated. It shows the changing relationship in Asia and the post-colonial world that would eventually lead to a very different sort of arrangement in the post-war period. I will speak only very briefly about the post-war period, but it's worth noting that those several decades marked a whole variety of opportunities for China and the world, but also of missed chances. On the one hand, I think an opportunity which was taken up was the chance for China and Asia to forge a new relationship between countries that had previously been colonized or partly colonized. The Bandung Conference of 1955 being a good example, and here in the picture you see Jawaharlal Nehru, the Indian Prime Minister, and Chinese Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai at a time that was rather friendly, so presumably before 1962, when the two countries went to war with each other. And the feeling that India and China could be major players in shaping post-war Asian order was, I think, an important development which is even now still to bear its full fruit of success. But on the other hand, it was also a time of failure and missed chances. The United States and China became isolated from each other, and being very neutral and objective, I have to put the blame on both sides. The United States should have given diplomatic recognition to China in the early 1950s when the communists won, but China also should not have worked with Stalin and Kim Il-sung to invade South Korea. So I think both sides have to take some of the responsibility on that one. And it meant, of course, that we had more than a quarter of a century of isolation until the Nixon-Kissinger visits to Mao in 1972 that eventually started to move into a new order. Finally, of course, in the late Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union opened the way for China to take a stronger economic and geopolitical role. And in the last decade or so, as we know, that process has continued to grow. The Beijing Olympics, of course, marking a new confidence nearly 10 years ago, with the idea of China as a country that could participate in that language of international sport and cultural power. The emergence of the internet, one of the single most important factors in changing Chinese society. I cannot count the number of people in the 3 days I've been here who tell me how foolish I am not to be on WeChat, and that's going to have to change quite soon. But also, of course, therefore, a world where realistically China can never be isolated in a true sense again, as long as the internet connections actually operate, particularly when you have more than the entire US population in numbers actually online. New challenges which go well beyond national boundaries, environmental issues being the most obvious, and this very week we know that President Trump may decide to withdraw from the 2015 Paris Climate Change Agreement. As I think Professor Dwara was indicating, this may be the best chance that China has to take a leadership role in the global community beyond the boundaries of the nation state. I think it will be a testing time for America, but actually also for China as well to take this opportunity. And then finally at the end, as we come to bring some of these ideas together, a revival in this new globalized world of historical ideas of greater, of longer and shorter significance. So the historical past, new ideas about the Silk Road, I think would not have been heard in the time of Chairman Mao, because they're about trade, they're about commerce, and they're about cooperation, rather than revolution and 自力更生, self-sufficiency. So I think, although it is a very old historical example, it's being used to make some quite pointed ideas about the world today. But I also find that the new interest within the last 10, 15 years in the Second World War in China, culminating, of course, in the military parade in 2015 in Tiananmen on the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, is also a very important part of that shared understanding. And I would argue for more globalization of this particular history, On the left-hand side, we have here the TV show shown in Chongqing about 10 years ago now, slightly more than 10 years, showing the history of Chongqing as the Peido, the temporary capital, and you can see the box comparing it with Washington, D.C., Moscow, and London. It's a very explicit combination. But on the right-hand side, we have a classic news photo of London after it was bombed in the Blitz in World War II by the Germans. And I think that the awareness of the left-hand picture of Chongqing in the Western world, in Britain and the US, is simply very limited at the moment. I think understanding more how during a time of great peril for the world community, China, Britain, and the United States work together is a language, is a narrative, is a story that should be told more and understood in more detail. I think this is particularly relevant for Britain at a time that Brexit is coming along from Europe, to remind ourselves as well as the rest of the world that we are capable of cooperation. And I think it's also good for China to remind itself that international cooperation has always been a part of the way in which the country operates, particularly at times of great danger. So let's finish with perhaps one of the iconic pictures of our time. I'm thinking of the, of course, classic picture of Richard Nixon and Chairman Mao nearly 50 years ago. And we have another Chinese leader and another American leader. Of course, some people have suggested some connections between Nixon and Trump. I couldn't comment on those. But I think that the point is that they are at the next stage of inheritance of the world at the end of World War II, the post-1945 world. And both the United States and China, as they come out of that Mar-a-Lago summit into the next phase of development, need to remember that the role that they hold is historically informed. I think it is one of the indictments of President Trump that he doesn't seem to either read or know or understand the historical role that the United States has played in this and every other region. I would say that both China and the United States, because of their contributions and sacrifices as long ago as World War II, more than 70 years ago, both earned the right to have a significant say and presence in the post-1945 world in Asia. And that is still true today. I think it is hard to imagine an Asia-Pacific that can be stable and peaceful without the cooperative relationship between China and the United States. But the point is that both of those powers are needed for balance. China should welcome the continued presence of the United States in the East Asia region, and the United States should seek to bring China more firmly into the cooperative community that shapes this area. With that type of cooperation, with that type of engagement, the wider project of the New Silk Road, I think, has a much greater chance of success. And those of us watching from Europe, where I live, will be, I think, highly pleased to see these two important figures coming together to forge a more stable and more peaceful Asia from which Europe and the rest of the world can only benefit. Thank you very much.